10 Oscars, a Palme d'Or at Cannes, and 31 BAFTAs, and several of which you'll agree all contain very memorable soundtracks. Even today, David still keeps in touch with the film industry as president of the Film Distributors Association and as life president of the National Film and Television School in the UK. David has accomplished a lot in his life, and reading his achievements can seem quite overwhelming. Now, did I mention he's also a former president of UNICEF and currently a UNICEF ambassador, and I am delighted he has taken time out of his busy schedule to speak to us today. And I'm looking forward to hearing an engaging talk from such a master storyteller. So I'd like to welcome Lord David Puttnam. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's very nice. The last bit of being a master storyteller, I hope I'm a master. I'm going to intend to try to be a truth teller because I think there's a lot of ground we need to cover, and we happen to be having this conversation at a kind of pretty critical juncture. I think in all of our lives, but certainly in the lives of our kids and my grandchildren. What I'd like to do is slightly unusual, but not actually something I've done before. So I'm experimenting as well here. So the title is Shining a Light in a Post-Truth Era. And that's, I think, the issue we'll continually come back to. But the truth is, if I rattle through everything I'd like to talk about, we could go down all sorts of rabbit holes. I'm eager not to do that. It's worth just, and it's not, I hope it's not showing off, worth mentioning 4 things that really inform me greatly. And the committees I either chaired or sat on. I chaired the communications select committee, or not select committee, committee in 2002 and 3 in the House of Lords that actually set up Ofcom. To that extent, the current regulatory system in the UK, which is right now in the centre of a new piece of legislation called the Online Harms Bill, that was formed. And, and that was 2 years of very hard work trying to get the regulatory system right. I think we got a lot of things right. And I think there's a lot of things that we probably could have and should have strengthened at the time, but we weren't allowed to, as it were, go digital. We were dealing with the media world as it was then. And of course, it's changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Then in 2008, I chaired the House of Lords committee scrutinizing the climate change bill. Now that was important. We set up the world's first, the very first in the world, climate change targets, which became law. The government to this day has to abide by the targets that we set at that time, which in the process right now are being revised and in a sense strengthened. So that was an important piece of legislation. That was a couple of years' work. I sat on the AI committee looking at the future of AI and the dangers implicit in AI. That committee sat throughout 2018. It was a very interesting, certainly a learning curve for me. And then, as Peter's been saying, most recently, I chaired the select committee looking at the impact of information and misinformation on democracy. And it was a real eye-opener. I'd like to kick off, if I may, with 3 quotes, recent quotes, all relevant. The first one actually is from The Times today. They have a section called Red Box. And it's a short piece by a very, very good Labour MP called Darren Jones. Darren is chair of the, I don't want to get his title right. He's chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Technology and National Security. He's also chairman of the Institute of Artificial Intelligence. And he kicks off his article by saying this. It's a short piece today, and I commend it to you. The UK's democratic values and institutions shape our approach to national security and our position as a global power. Our first priority is to protect them. But I'm delighted with it, but as the House of Lords Select Committee on Democracy and Digital Technologies concluded, the integrity of our elections in the United Kingdom is under threat from rapid technological change and a pandemic of misinformation online. He goes on to say, education reform is also vitally important. The government should implement a strategy to increase digital media and civic literacy, and this should be underpinned by regulation and complemented with training and resources. That's something we're going to come back to several times. That's for sure. Next thing is from yesterday's Guardian. Aditya Chakraborty was talking about Dominic Cummings' evidence yesterday. I don't know if any of you had the stomach for or the stamina to listen to it. But what he's saying, and I totally agree with, is actually what came under scrutiny yesterday, more than scrutiny, I'd argue, was really the inadequacy of the machinery of government. The fact that clearly in Britain, the Prime Minister has far too much power, and that when you consider the select committee that was scrutinizing him yesterday, those committees, they were only set up in 1979. They were reformed and improved by Tony Blair 20 years ago. But this is comparatively recent form of accountability. And yet what was established yesterday, I think beyond doubt from Cummings' evidence, is that there's nothing like enough. Effectively, Cummings' evidence was an indictment of the entire British governing class. And we have a lot of lessons to learn, without doubt, here in Ireland. I have no doubt at all about that. What Chakraborty ends up by saying is, the result is that Johnson's UK stands alongside Donald Trump's US as a cautionary tale of what happens when a ragtag bunch of cash-in merchants, state haters, and incompetent braggarts are allowed to run a country that's in grave danger. Not dissimilar from the piece that Fintan O'Toole wrote actually last weekend in the Irish Times. So there's a growing sense of unease and disquiet, and a sense that maybe we actually don't have government machinery that's up to the tasks that confront all of us. The last one of these is from a former colleague of mine, David Miliband, who was given an award at MIT just last month. And he said this at the end of his acceptance speech: "The drift to impunity will not be stopped without those with economic power taking a stand. The next decade promises to be a race or a fight between accountability and impunity within our own countries and internationally. And this applies in politics, in economics, and even in respect of the environment." I think he's 100% right, that it is a battle between a growing sense of impunity by many people in power and our own attempt to become resilient to it and become seekers of truth. And here's where we land, if you like, with today's theme. I could go on, and I won't, I promise you. This is the report that Peter referred to. 77,000 words, it's a big fat document. I'm going to particularly focus on the recommendations in chapter 7 relating to education and digital literacy. But that's why I'm avoiding, unless you ask me to in questions, going into too much detail. It's a big piece of information. Now, the last thing I want to do, because I'm personally intrigued, it's just I've never done before. I'm going to quote at quite a bit of length, actually, from a speech I gave in 2012. 2012 was a big year for me. It was the year we started Atticus here. It was the year of the London Olympics, which probably, as a high point of hope and possibility, was as good as I can ever remember. And what a different world we're living in today. So this is a pre-COVID world, pre-Brexit, pre-Trump, pre-post-truth, the concept of that we're living in post-truth world. The speech was given to an organization you'll all be familiar with, I think, was to the annual LIR conference. It was actually in Glasgow that year, at Glasgow Caledonian University. And it was a really terrific audience. I was more knocked out with it by the audience and the questions from the audience than I was by anything, frankly, I had to say. I have a copy here, and I'm very happy to send it to anyone who's interested. I didn't have a title, weirdly, or if I did have a title, it's not in the copy I've got. What I should have called it, looking back, was Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Now, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow happens to be the title of a really good Vittorio De Sica movie that I saw in New York in 1964, if you can believe it, starring Sophia Loren and Marcello Mastroianni. And I loved the movie, but it would have been a great title for this speech, because what emerges from my rereading it is that, in a sense, everything has changed, and yet absolutely nothing has changed. And the really scary thing is that both the everything that's changed has thrown up brand new problems for us, and the nothing that's changed is truly alarming, because the things that need to have happened and should have happened simply in those 9 intervening years simply haven't happened. So if I may, I'm going to quote myself, because I actually think it's very informative. And please know that I'm speaking here in 2012. So good morning. It's a pleasure to have been asked to come to speak to you. In 1997, I made a huge personal decision to leave the world of cinema after 30 happy and I hope productive years, to engage full-time in a very different world of public policy, most particularly as it relates to education, the creative industries, media regulation, and most recently, climate change. Unsurprising, this has involved a steep learning curve and a fair number of personal and domestic compromises. The result of all of that has been a series of new lives, each of which has offered real sense of satisfaction and even from time to time cause for actual celebration. What's certain is I've absolutely no regrets for having made this change. And all in all, it's left me feeling pretty good about the decision and its outcome. It's also allowed me the opportunity to engage with people who every day of their working lives are attempting to mold the building blocks, the quality of which will determine our ability to secure the future. These building blocks are, of course, our children, and the people I find myself most frequently working with are their teachers. And if, certainly as I see it, the future looks increasingly bleak, a kind of battle, if you like, then teachers are pretty well the only infantry that's available to us. This battle I'm referring to is between what I've increasingly come to see as our largely failed present and the possibility of an altogether more imaginative future. And it's not simply that I want a more imaginative future. It's more the case that, at least in my judgment, there won't be much of a future of any sort unless we're prepared to become significantly more imaginative, most particularly in respect of the way in which we educate young people. And here, of course, it was immediately off the back of my doing the climate change report. If we truly are prepared to take on the immense challenges of the 21st century, then I believe we've no choice but to embrace the equally immense power of the most recent digital technologies, and to do so in a way that makes our first 20 years of progress look exactly what it's been, pitifully inadequate. Let's face it, in many respects, life in the UK, as in other parts of the world, has been literally transformed since the turn of the century. Digital technologies, mobile telephony, and the internet in particular have fundamentally reshaped the way in which people of every age connect with, make sense of, and engage with society. And as most of you, let's just say librarians, know better than most, rightly or wrongly, people expect an entirely new form of relationship with the world around them, one that simply doesn't rely on accessing information, but on creating new knowledge, new products, and even new resources. It's worth mentioning there that at the time I had just become, I think, Chancellor of the Open University, having been the Chancellor of the University of Sunderland, and I'd watched the process by which previously book-based, or largely book-based libraries had become digital havens for good or ill, so that the physical nature of libraries had changed during the time that I had been working within government. Learning is no longer something that needs to happen within particular hours in a particular place or even with a particular group of people. The immense power of the World Wide Web means that a fantastic knowledge resource is just a click away. In schools, in colleges, homes, and on the move, to the extent that anyone with an internet connection has the power to access this extraordinary treasure trove of knowledge within literally seconds, anytime, any place. This is knowledge occurring in a way that our predecessors could barely have dreamed of, and yet, just that week, Andreas Schleicher, a friend of mine who runs the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, had said this: knowledge and skills have become the global currency of the 21st century, but there is no central bank that actually prints this currency. I said, a digital society is or should be just that, a society in which we thoughtfully balance our rights with our responsibility to respect and, most importantly, to learn from others. Surely we need to create learning environments in which informed responses to the challenges of the 21st century are encouraged and nurtured. This would be a world in which prejudice and ignorance would hopefully become rather better understood for exactly what they are. And yet, despite endless speeches about the degree to which our future global economy is dependent on the development of creativity and imagination, can we honestly claim to be doing anything tangible to locate and release those talents? And at best, I'd have to say, nothing like enough. Tied as we are to our existing structures and precepts, I'm not sure we're even entirely sure how to go about releasing them. Students starting school this year, bear in mind, this is 2012, will enter the world of work at some point between 2025 and 2030 and retire around 2075, assuming they can afford to. Given that we can't with any degree of certainty predict what the world's going to look like in 5, let alone 10 years from now, we've certainly no idea of what it's going to look like in 2075. So the very best we can do is prepare today's students for a world of increasing unpredictability, equipping them with the necessary degree of cooperation, agility, compassion, and intelligence to anticipate and deal with many unknown challenges that will exist over the next 20 years. I finish by saying this. I'll jump right to the back. I think we all acknowledge that as a human species, we know more than we've ever known about ourselves and our natural environment. So if I may, I'll leave you with a quote from the environmentalist and futurist Stuart Brand, which, whilst ostensibly flattering, is also very cautionary. We are as gods, so we better start getting good at it. So that was 9 years ago. 9 years ago. I have to say that at my darkest and most pessimistic moment, I don't think I could have envisaged how backwards, to the degree to which we've gone backwards rather than forwards. Yes, technology in some ways has become simpler and cleverer, but the use of technology has become more complex, and the pernicious impact of technology has become ever more frightening, in fact, quite scary. I wouldn't have believed it possible that I would have sat for a year, taken evidence, and come up with a report like this. When I really originally did it, I was going to call it Digital Technology and the Restoration of Trust. The evidence we took was so damning and so worrying that I substituted the word restoration with the word resurrection. I actually believe we've reached a point where trust is so absent from our political, economic, and lives generally, that it's nothing less than the resurrection of trust is needed, because we've reached the bottom. I hope we've reached the bottom, although who knows, I might not be right. Chapter 7 of this report is all about, it's actually entitled Active Digital Citizens. It is all about what we might do to improve the situation of the understanding of digital citizens and the teaching of digital citizens. We've been promised in Britain for 4 years now a digital strategy for education. Nothing's been forthcoming. A recent question in Parliament, we asked where it was. We were told it's going to be published before the end of this year. That is an absurdity. The problem in Britain, and I don't know if this you agree that this is true in Ireland, is a complete misunderstanding between the teaching of computers, and full digital understanding of the world of information and the way in which we think and learn. Somehow or other, the educational community in the UK has totally confused the two and believes that by teaching us to use a computer, we are somehow implicitly or explicitly teaching digital literacy. We know, you know, I know, we're not. The issue really is, how serious is that? Is that really going to blight our future? Is it really, are we in a position possibly to play catch up? Or are we in such a serious situation that 9 years from now, that's to say in 2030, we'll still have learned nothing, but we'll be looking at not just a hill to climb, an absolute mountain to climb, which may even prove insurmountable. And lurking in the corner are two very, very serious threats. One, politically, is fascism, and the other, environmentally, is devastating climate change. Both those lurk, waiting for us around the corner, unless we find a way of correcting our course we're on and solving the problems we've established for ourselves. So there's my roughly 20 minutes. I'm more than happy to answer any questions on this or any other aspect of what I've done throughout my life, for that matter, but certainly during my 24 years in Parliament.
Thank you so much, David. That was kind of stark, actually. Let's be honest about it. It's, I guess, you know, the way we kind of look at it in Ireland is sometimes I feel like we look to the UK a lot for leadership on some issues like this, and I feel like, you know, if you guys haven't got it worked out, I'm not sure that we have either. But maybe you could tell us, you know, and please, audience members, submit your questions to the chat. If there's anything you want to ask, please start sending them in, and don't leave me here talking, because I'll keep talking.
And I'm pleased. Otherwise, just wasted. 20 minutes of your time.
Not wasted at all. I guess like one of the things that I'd like to ask is you know, in compiling that report and in compiling your recommendations, you know, where do we start? Like what's the first step? Because sometimes insurmountable tasks and huge mountains to climb, it's almost not useful to think of them in that way. But if you can break it down and be like, okay, this is the first step. You know, what in your opinion is the first step? What would you suggest, or what would you like to see happening first?
Well, I'm not the first person to say this. President Clinton claims it was him, but I think there was some before him. The first step always is acknowledging the depth of the problem. If you won't acknowledge the problem, you're not going to come up with any answers. And so long as as we pretend to live in a sustainable environment, and as long as we pretend to live in a situation in which politics is done in the way that it could and needs to be done, and certainly in this respect, I think Ireland is better than the UK for a number of reasons, actually. Partly to do with, I think, the short communication line between politicians and the public. Unless we acknowledge the depth of the problem, we're not going to solve it. And in truth, that's the starting point. That has to be the starting point. But it's painful, extremely painful. And you know, all the temptation for all of us is to get on with today, to get on with today's problems, to get on with today's challenge, and leave tomorrow to be something else. But the issue, as I see it, is that these things have crept up on us, and we've lacked the agency. I don't really like using the word; it's so overused. But that we've lacked the agency to turn things around or turn things back. I'm not sure we even believe we can.
Yeah, that's again stark.
Yeah.
But and what do you think, like the whole loss of trust and the kind of the loss of trust in institutions, in experts, in everything, you know, when do you see that happening? Because I, like when you mentioned it, the 2012 Olympics, like it was a time of real optimism, it was a time of real kind of, you know, feel good engagement at a kind of international level. There was kind of this feeling of international goodwill around the Olympics. And I think that, you know, it was in social media, it was quite positive, all the stories that came out. And, you know, but it just seemed to kind of flip almost. It's like it ran away with us. And where did that happen? Like, did it happen at a government level, or are we talking that, you know, the social media aspect of it kind of took over? Like how did we disconnect from trusting our institutions and our experts?
Hard to know when it really started. I mean, the obvious thing that's been missing, horribly gone absent, is a combination of wisdom and leadership. I don't think wisdom really is applied to many problems nowadays. Now, the interesting thing is, the one thing we've learned from the pandemic is we've had to trust experts, and some of them have proved to be, I think, outstanding in that particular field. And we've had to listen to their accumulated wisdom. It would have been even better had there been more admissions of failure. One of our areas of fragility is the difficulty politicians find in putting their hands up and saying, "I got that wrong," and at the same time sustaining trust. So we've got to be grown up enough to understand that we can trust people more when they're prepared to acknowledge their failings, or prepared to acknowledge their learnings, or prepared to acknowledge the things they've got wrong, than when they pretend they haven't got anything wrong. There was a very, very interesting moment in David Cameron's career. What amazes me is he learned nothing from it. Or there were two moments. One was when he made the apology for the Hillsborough disaster publicly, and the other was when he made the apology for Bloody Sunday. Now, I don't know how to what extent he was dreading doing this, because I'm sure both of them were done against official advice. But what was remarkable, particularly about the Bloody Sunday one, was the eruption of relief. I remember the cheer that went up from people that he'd told the truth. He'd actually told the truth at last. And we live in a world of, tragically, of cover-up. And we also live in a world where before anyone's prepared to tell the truth, they want to have tested the water with some market research to find out how that truth is going to go down. That is not leadership. You can't lead from there. You don't lead by finding what people want to hear and then telling them what they want to hear. So I think the pandemic in that sense has been quite helpful in people having to acknowledge stuff they didn't necessarily want to hear. I think by and large, although there's been some egregious examples of stupidity, I think people have behaved remarkably well. Certainly around here in West Cork, they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And like sometimes even hearing an unpalatable truth or something that you wish wasn't true is better than the lie. Like there's solace in that, you know? And
Absolutely, it's growing up. It's developing a sense of wisdom, and very sweetly you said that it was quite stark what I said, but then the title of today was shining a light on a post-truth era. We're living in a post-truth era, and by trying to tell the truth of how difficult it is, I don't blame you for using the word stark, but I feel I'm just doing your favor. I'm telling the truth as I see it.
yeah, absolutely. And we need more voices like that are willing to stand up and tell the truth, whatever the truth may be. We have a question here from Peter. Has the inequality in Britain contributed to this problem, I suppose, to the mistrust of the government, the mistrust of experts, do you think?
Yes, I think very, very greatly, because there is, without doubt, there is an underserved underclass allowed to develop, who, and if you want to put Brexit down to, no, I'm a passionate Remainer. If you want to put Brexit down to anything, it was about people who felt totally left behind and ignored. And very untruthfully and maliciously, the Brexiters, the Brexit campaign exploited that ignorance. They didn't exploit knowledge. They exploited ignorance. They exploited a vacuum of created by ignorance, and that's just got worse since, frankly.
Yeah, I can totally recognize that. Just, I guess it's interesting as an Irish person, I watched it from the outside and you could see the lies in the media from the Brexit campaign, and but you could see how insidious those lies were and how attractive they were to certain groups of the population, which is very difficult.
Try and imagine how it was heartbreaking for me. I spent 10 years and I loved it up there as Chancellor of the University of Sunderland. I spent a lot of time in the Northeast. They're great people. When that result came in from Sunderland, that was the Brexit result came in, I was broken because I had been to every school in that region. I'm still patron of schools Northeast. The fact that somehow we didn't get the truth of the message across is appalling. Northeast has probably benefited more from subsidies and support from Europe than almost any other region in the UK, or Northeast and the Southwest. And yet somehow or other, the great lie won.
Yeah, it's very difficult. My partner is from Scotland, so he was pretty heartbroken at that result. So we have a question from Niamh here. Do you think that any country is doing well and leading the way with this? Like, is there someone we should be looking to?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in different areas, when we took evidence of this, I keep holding it up, this brick, two places that certainly impressed us greatly, particularly on the educational front, and for the same reason. One was Estonia and one was Finland. And the reason is a simple one, actually. It's because they both live in an existential crisis next door to Russia. Therefore, they can't, and they both have large Russian-speaking populations, particularly Estonia. They can't afford the luxury of misinformation, because misinformation could tilt the entire country into chaos. So they are very, very cautious and very careful about the utilization of digital technology, the utilization of information, and the accuracy of information, the checking of information, but they're doing it from an existential point of view. So the further a country feels it is removed from danger, the more liable it is to be sucked into misinformation, hence the United States. Because the United States regards itself as relatively impervious to imminent dangers, it can afford the luxury of being thoroughly wall-to-wall misinformed without having to worry about the ramifications of that. So that's the lesson I learned, was the closer you are to understanding the existential dangers you are, and that's one of our dangers in Ireland. I think we are a very secure nation. We're well liked, we're well thought of. Therefore, we can afford, in a sense, to get away from being complacent about our information sources.
Wow, that's really interesting. And we had a talk from Christine Bohan from the Journal fact-checking unit, and her perspective was really interesting in that we didn't have a misinformation issue pre-COVID, but it has absolutely exploded in the last year. and it has become, something of its own kind of pandemic almost or epidemic, I suppose, in Ireland. Which it's interesting, our security is giving us license almost to allow conspiracy theories to breed.
Well, I'd also add one other, just not directly, but it was an interesting learning for me. I was asked by RTE about 3 years ago to do a brief report. I'd done a similar thing in the UK. I'd chaired a committee looking at the future of the BBC. And I was asked to do a similar thing to look at RTE. And then they arranged for me to meet politicians of all parties, and I did. And with a couple of very notable exceptions, and one of them ironically happens to be the Taoiseach, which is nice, almost every one of them had some personal grudge about RT, something that either RT hadn't done, but they wanted to do, or had done because it had offended themselves locally. And what I realized was quite extraordinary is the entire perception of public broadcasting here at home, for my home here in Ireland, was through a prism of some personal experience by a politician. Now, to use that as a way of judging your primary information system is an absurdity. Of course it is. But in the end, I couldn't do the report. I mean, the report, frankly, if I'd done the report, I either was going to never be spoken to by anyone in the Dáil again, or almost everyone in the Dáil again, or I'd be drummed out of the country, and I didn't want to do that. So I just didn't do the report.
Yeah. It's the localism, I suppose, in Ireland that is, something we all know. You have to be cautious about what you say because you're very likely going to annoy somebody down the road.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So Sarah Webb has a comment here. How do we as teachers and librarians try to teach these digital skills while increasingly politicians seem to dismiss any sense of the importance of truth and trust as being? Working as a librarian, running fake news and source evaluation workshops. I love working with young people, but it seems that people are rewarded for not behaving with honesty and integrity. I'm trying not to sound dispirited.
No, I mean, and there's no point getting dispirited because it doesn't say anything. The future does lie in young people. I think the important thing is to have strategies and set a fairly high bar. That's to say, I'm permanently, I'm afraid, critical of the Leaving Cert, simply because I think it doesn't capture things like this. So I would love to see the Leaving Cert kind of rethought through to ensure that a thing like digital literacy and understanding multiple sources and understanding the ability to question what's being told becomes literally a fundamental in getting your points. Personally, I'd prefer to move completely away from the point system, but if we're stuck with a point system, then at least within that point system, try to make sure that we are we're teaching 21st century competent skills and 24th century competent citizens.
Absolutely. That whole kind of area of critical thinking and how we engage, point out to people that you need to engage with critical thinking and evaluate the information. But I think, young people in general, I think they have the opportunity, but sometimes I'm dismayed at what, say, my generation and even my parents' generation are sharing on social media without any thought, like that real kind of clickbait stuff that they retweet or share on Facebook. So I think, be good to see those critical thinking skills go beyond the Leaving Cert and beyond young people and kind of become, something that we can
normalize.
Point the whole, everybody to engage with.
I mean, you look for little rays of sunshine, and I do. I mean, I'm remorselessly apolitical here in Ireland because I'm too political back in the UK. But we had we got a TD down in Cork, Holly Cairns. Now, Holly came. I knew her as a small. She has a small farm. She used social media and telling the truth as a weapon at the last election, and stunned a lot of the old time local politicians here when she won. I mean, that was she originally got onto the council, Cork County Council, and then became a TD. So if people like Holly do emerge, who base their campaigns on truth telling and fact checking and putting it out there and using social media to get facts out there, yes, I think it is possible to begin to what shall we say, to attack the influence of people who have traditionally, be careful what I'm trying to say here, who have traditionally come up through a system that rewards evasion. Let's forget lies, just awards evasion, awards buddyship, awards deals done out of untransparent deals being done. You can do it. And I think Holly is a wonderful example of how it is possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've followed Holly's career as well. She's definitely a voice of reason out there and a voice of truth, as you said. So Eleanor has a question here. Do you see the move away from mainstream media with its own issues, but it was at least legislated to a degree, to the online Google experts and the rise of online fascism as one of the biggest issues we have to face today outside of climate change?
Yes. What we had was a regulated system that was regulated by two things. It was regulated by a kind of individual dignity. That's to say, if you went to work for the public service broadcasters, I think it was true in RT, in fact, I know it's true in RT and the UK, you knew you were not going to earn big money. That wasn't the point. You were actually part of a very dignified profession. Now, this is easy stuff for me to say because my dad was a journalist. My dad in the end left Fleet Street when he felt it was going rotten. And my dad was the most honest man I've ever met in my life. In a sense, whole of my life has been committed to try to be as much like him as I could possibly be. So I find it very easy to talk about this stuff. We had a form of a form of media that was regulated both by actual regulation, in the case of television, and cultural, a cultural dignity, where journalists were quite proud of being journalists. Didn't mean there weren't terrible things happening, there were. And my dad, I remember saying to me once that in particular, the crime reporters, in order to do their job, ended up becoming very close to relatively corrupt policemen because that's how they got scoops. And so he said there were always these gray areas, but for the most part, journalists were very proud of being journalists and it was an honorable profession. But, you know, there's a thing published every single year called the Edelman Trust Barometer. And you just look at that year on year. You go back 10 years, see what's happened. Thank God teachers and medics retain a very, very high level of trust. But what's happened to journalism, what's happened to politicians is nearly catastrophic. They're in the single digit categories now.
Goodness. I suppose we've had so many kind of scandals within the journalism profession with phone hacking and all of that. You know, I guess that takes from the profession's integrity as a whole. Unfortunately, it tarnishes the whole whole. I can't think what I'm trying to say, but like I suppose we can't throw it all out. There are still really good journalists out there, and there are people who are, you know, reporting the truth. But when you're bombarded with so much information, it can be hard. Again, it comes back to that critical thinking and evaluating your sources and who is telling me this, you know, and what is their kind of agenda.
Absolutely. I'll just give you an illustration. So I certainly would not want to for a moment defend that BBC got it wrong with Martin Bashir and all that, but there needs to be a sense of proportion. They got it wrong and they had to really, in a way, grovel almost too much. And yet there's another cover-up which will emerge quite soon, the murder of a guy called Peter Morgan, which has been covered up for 25 years and which will, I think, emerge a far more serious cover-up, except part of the cover-up is the news media. And the news media, in collusion with the police and politicians, have managed to cover up a really terrible story, far more serious than the Martin Bashir thing. But of course, it suited the news media to attack the BBC, and the BBC became hyper defensive. So it's also a question of getting proportion, which is, yes, that's wrong, but is that as wrong as that? I mean, you know, and that's the problem. So our sources of information can mislead us as to where our sense of proportion should be.
Yeah, those social media pylons can really kind of blow things out of proportion, especially, you know, when things are being retweeted. I better go back to the questions here. There's one here from Siobhan. Why is there still practically no ethical discussion within governments regarding new technology developments, especially the use of AI?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of confusion over AI. There's not a lot of knowledge of AI. There's quite a lot of fear as well. One of the great things I had when I spent 5 years as Ireland's digital champion was access to, for example, security services. And what they would always say to me was, you've got to understand the level of confusion there is. And I remember them saying at the time, the fact that Ireland's banks, for example, we've just had the ghastly situation with HSE, hadn't been attacked by people who were familiar with and very sophisticated AI was a near miracle. So I think that AI prompts a whole series of opportunities for all of us, in medicine and all sorts of other areas, but a whole set of brand new and quite frightening possibilities. That article I mentioned right at the beginning from the Times today, that's really essentially what he's highlighting, is the use of AI terrorism, effectively, to create chaos.
Yeah, it's frightening, and I suppose that, you know, for a lot of the tech, it's interesting with technology because, you know, in the past, new technologies came online, and for the most people could understand the basis of how they worked. You know, things like electricity, the telephone, radio, cars. You know, we could fundamentally understand the physics of how they worked, or the technology behind them. I think with things like AI, you know, it's moved so beyond our day-to-day understanding of the world that we live in, that like even understanding the risks can be kind of beyond most people. They're hard discussions to have, and like if only the experts are in the room discussing it, it's easy to miss, you know, the concerns of the people on the ground, I suppose, or people this technology might be applied to, I think, sometimes.
Well, it's also, you're requiring that the experts themselves are honest, because if the people who, you know, the black boxes that are controlled by the Googles and the Facebooks are potentially lethal. And what point I always try to make is, I don't for one moment believe that young Mark Zuckerberg, when he founded Facebook, or the guys when they founded Google, were bad people. I don't think they tried to create anything bad. The problem was they created something that was so successful and had so much velocity to it that when big capital started piling in and the share prices started rocketing, they actually lost control of it. So it's not a question of whether Zuckerberg would or wouldn't like to open up his black box and actually begin to limit the damage that Facebook potentially can do. It's that as it were, the city, the big money wouldn't then do that, because the impact on their share price would be enormous. So what they've done is they've got a distorted business model, which requires dishonesty in order to generate the resources the returns that it generates. And this is I'm not sure that's ever really happened before. Maybe it did happen. Maybe it happened with the railway, with the great railway barons. It maybe it happened the early part of the 20th century, but not since.
Yeah, it really is a new frontier, and you know, I think governments have taken tentative steps towards reining in some of these huge companies and commercial organizations, but I can't think of any kind of real concrete sort of move any government has made towards, you know, controlling their access, or, you know, protecting its citizens, or, you know, really kind of questioning the ethics of what the big social media companies and online companies are doing.
Well, it's worth saying it's a particular problem for Ireland, because Ireland is de facto, as it were, fat controller of a lot of these companies. And I know her. Helen Dixon's a really, really good woman. She's got a nightmare job, because she's trying to balance out serious aspects of the Irish economy, which are related to these companies, and at the same time, a regulatory system that's driven out of Europe. There's an interesting document, I've got it here, European Media Freedom Act, being driven out of Europe. Europe's further ahead than anywhere else in the world. The EU itself is further ahead than anywhere else in the world in looking at regulatory principles and processes. The problem for Helen is that she's going to be required to implement them. And in implementing them, there's obviously going to be serious issues and complications with the Irish Treasury, because there's serious financial ramifications to implementing exactly the regulations that the EU will in the end impose on us. You know, there's a fascinating thing. I think the EU was remarkably loyal to Ireland during the whole Brexit process, and has been. But there will be payback time. And payback time will be in the form of, I think, a an agreed fixed taxation system, and Ireland actually doing exactly what it's obligated to do in terms of regulatory impact on the big tech companies. These are big issues, and Ireland's right. And I'm afraid Ireland's in the eye of that particular storm.
Yeah, I can see that coming down the line, and it's you as you put it, it's payback time. the EU stood by us at a particularly difficult time, and you know, Ireland may have to pay some sort of economic price for that. But there are payoffs in the protection of the citizens, you know, from new technologies and from data protection and everything. So Anya has a question here. Could open education and transparency in academia improve critical thinking in our wider society, especially if embedded in undergrad studies? I suppose this is of particular interest to a lot of the group here, as we are university librarians and involved in that kind of information literacy education for undergraduates.
I think the short answer is probably yes, except that I think it also requires levels of trust, and it also requires possibly the creation. I'm making this up as I go along here, so if I got it all wrong, but I've never been asked this question before. But I would see the requiring some form of closed loop systems. So the privileges that an undergraduate gets in being given, and of course, this is one of the arguments, incidentally, that Facebook make. They claim that the reason they won't allow researchers into their black boxes is because they're endangering their IP. So ironically, these two questions are somewhat related. But I think it requires, and maybe it does become part and parcel of the role of the librarians to create closed loop systems. Look, if I were a historian, and I want to go to the Library of Congress to check on some facts, it is possible, as a licensed historian, I might be shown papers and given details of things that might not be available to the general public. Now, if that's possible in the cases of national security and other issues, it ought to be possible in a library context. How you do it, how you police it, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. But I can't believe it's beyond the wit and guile of all of us to come up with systems where, at least to a limited degree, undergraduates can have access to material that is not broadly and generally available. Yes.
Very good. Aaron has a question here. Is it possible for government to communicate without the use of spin and get their message heard in the social media age? I suppose it's one of those things that like makes you a little mistrustful of politicians. It's this whole marketing spin that seems to be kind of embedded in government communications now.
You know, it's a very difficult question, a painful question for you, not difficult. I think that John Major, who I'm not sorry, I've never been a Tory, I'm a member of the Labour Party, was a very honest man and attempted to fulfill his job honestly. Spin and of course it's got much worse, but spin as we currently understand it was invented by my own party. I mean, there's no question that Peter Mandelson and people around him, Alistair Campbell, they did create the environment in which spin became a very cute and clever way of not so much of, I mean, I remember very well, and I promise you this is true. I worked for David Blunkett when he was Secretary of State for Education. And one day, and I had quite a good job there. One day we were announcing something. I said to him, David, we've actually announced this before. You know, he said, well, don't worry about that. He said, people won't remember we announced it before. We're going to announce it again because it's a great story. And once you start, and David Blunkett's an honest and decent man, but once you start buying into that kind of Kool-Aid, that it doesn't matter that you've announced it before, you're going to pretend it's the first time you said it. The justifications begin to pile in. Well, if that doesn't matter, what does this matter? Well, maybe that's on. So what you're doing, you're constantly salami slicing away at the integrity of government. And you think that no one's noticing, except the public do notice. So that's where trust starts to get eroded. So the people you want to trust, and Blunkett would be a very good example, even he bought into the idea that you span things a bit, and that was a legitimate way to operate. But once you do that, you're already immediately on a very slippery slope. And I think that's one of the things, incidentally, that Cummings was pointing to yesterday during his evidence, that it became habitual. I mean, he referred to Johnson as acting like a shopping trolley crashing down the aisles, because what he was doing constantly was trying to see how things were going to be received, not whether he's making the right decision. Is this the right decision? Maybe, but how's it going to go down? If it's not going to go down, well, I'll make a different decision. Now, that's not, as I said earlier, that's not leadership, it's not governance, and it's anything but wisdom.
Yeah. Wow. It's just, I guess it's you know, the simple idea of spin and you know, how it started quite maybe innocently, you know, has become one of the vehicles for the erosion of trust in government and institutions. James has a question here. How do you feel about the worrying trends in artificial intelligence? For example, emotion detecting software reported to be tested in Xinjiang, China. Can humanity help itself from going too far with technology?
Absolutely it can, but to bear in mind, these were questions being asked in the 1950s about lie detector tests and those emotion games, which you can look at on YouTube and see what was being done at the time. Quite scary stuff. I think there's one of the flaws we have in human beings is being conscious of when enough is enough. You know, the one subject I feel really comfortable with, is the rise of the Nazi Party. I did 2 movies, quite long movies, detailed movies, in 1971 and 72. One was called The Double-Headed Eagle, which was 1918 to 33, and the other was called Swastika, 33 to 45. And I became extraordinarily well versed in exactly how that had been sold, and the way in which public confidence have been either both undermined, the fact that we're coming from a bad place, pretending that we're going to a good place, the fact the National Socialist Party was called a socialist party when it was actually a fascist party. And that process is something I could bore for Ireland on. But it's such a learning thing. You see the playbook, the Goebbels playbook is not just a Goebbels playbook, it's an internal playbook, and it relies on being able to pile in with lies, and then even if they're half believed, pile in with another one, and then you pile in with another one. And what you do is in the end, you create a form of terror. Now that requires several things. It requires you find a victim. It requires you actually find people who are the other. And I think, and here's my fear, I'll probably be long dead. I think my biggest thing for Ireland is that the result of climate change will be tremendous pressure on migration from climate affected areas. I think that as a humanitarian country, we will probably accept significant levels of refugees. And then your next question is a question of character. How will we avoid somebody in politics deciding that the best angle to power is to target the refugees that have been brought in for humanitarian reasons? And that, if I was to write a play or a scenario for Ireland 2035, 2040, that's where I wanted to write a bit of a scare story. That's the scare story I'd write. The rise to power of someone thoroughly unscrupulous who uses a humanitarian crisis to create fear in the indigenous population.
A frightening thought, and let's hope that it doesn't come to pass. But I suppose time will tell. So Carol asks, do national broadcasters have a role to play in delivering digital literacy skills? I can learn to cook, so survive in the wild via TV shows. Can we have digital literacy learning on our national broadcaster? Sorry, David, you're on mute all of a sudden.
I don't know what happened there. Okay, am I back on?
You're back on, yep.
That was scary. Digital literacy. I would say that the national broadcasters can certainly support it and help it. I don't think they can create it. I think it has to be created in a more individualized space. But to do that, and this is a concern, and everyone on this call will have the same concern, that the people teaching it, the librarians, the teachers teaching it, have to develop the kind of confidence to be able to teach it with confidence. Young people are not going to be impressed by teachers who they feel are floundering around on the subject themselves, who are having problems. I was been involved in educational technology for a long time, and I've always known that the key to making it work is it's got to be a switch as simple as switching a light on. If the teacher is insecure about the technology and insecure about the subject matter, they will not be able to teach it well. So you need highly digitally literate teachers and librarians to create an aura of confidence that students can kind of absorb and respond to.
That's very interesting, and I do think I recognize something in that. I think the best teachers that I've had, definitely in the past, have been the ones who, you know, have been really immersed in their topic and really, you know, had an in-depth working understanding of what they were talking about. And I guess the tricky thing is that the digital world is changing so fast.
Yeah.
It can be hard to, you know, if you're a librarian with other responsibilities as well, it can be hard to completely immerse yourself in that world and keep up to date almost with how it's changing.
I can cite you an example because it's going back to the University of Sunderland for a second. The University of Sunderland's got a very good school of education run by a woman called Lynn McKenna. Funny enough, I wrote to her this morning. She was talking about the fact they're graduating just over 1,000 teachers a year into teaching practice, initial teacher training. She said that one of the things they've got is a module on digital teaching, a specific module that you have to have passed in order to graduate. What's happening is that the teachers they're graduating during their teaching practice year, I don't know if it's the same in Ireland, but you have a teaching practice year in Ireland, but in the UK before you're qualified, are doing seminars for the rest of the staff on digital learning and teaching and learning. So it's quite extraordinary. So our as yet unfully qualified teachers are becoming mentors to teachers. Now that depends entirely on the teachers who are within the class being prepared to accept that. That must be quite painful. You know, if you've been teaching 10, 15 years and you've got someone who's arriving straight out of teacher training college who hasn't even officially qualified, telling you about digital literacy, that's painful. And you've got to be quite a big person to accept that.
Yeah, I think we all learned a lot of digital literacy skills and digital kind of functioning skills this year with the change in our practice in COVID. But and it was quite a steep learning curve, at least initially, anyway. So there's a comment here from Neve, a bit off topic, but I'd be interested to hear what David thinks of celebrated or maybe celebrity truth tellers like Piers Morgan. So those people who set themselves up as you know, man of the people, woman of the people, I'm going to tell you the truth.
Well, first of all, what's fascinating is Piers Morgan's father was my best friend at school throughout my secondary, throughout my school. So that's kind of
personal collection.
His name was Glyn. I've watched Piers go from a really rather nice young man. He wrote to me saying, was it true that I was a friend of his father's when Chariots of Fire won the Oscar? And apparently I wrote back saying, yes, absolutely, and how much I'd adored his father. I've watched Piers become, in a sense, a victim of his own celebrity. It's been sad to watch. I'm sure he's making very good money, and I'm sure he's pretty pleased with himself, but I imagine because I know his background a bit, I imagine his dark night of the soul must be quite a painful one. Piers is not the person that he originally set out to be. He is, if you like, an apparently successful, but probably rather tragic figure. And I really believe that. And there are many, many like him. Here's an interesting thing. I've had a wonderful, wonderful life. I think that the number of people I've seen make apparently huge successes of their careers, but have also remained having really, really strong, good personal lives, I could number on the fingers of both hands.
Wow.
The pain and the price you pay for celebrity is colossal. And retaining a sense of yourself, retaining a sense of who you are, what you want to be, is hard. That's why I come back straight back to my dad. Had it not been for him, I could easily have gone off the rails.
That's really interesting, and it's a little bit sad as well. And I suppose, you know, maybe in the past, people who were celebrated actors or authors or journalists and stuff like that could retain a private life, but now currently with social media and the scrutiny that people in the public eye are under, you know, I know I couldn't cope with it. I think very few people could. Even, you know, our politicians, our councillors in Ireland, I've seen some news stories recently of people who've had their families threatened because they are in the public eye. I think it must be a very difficult place to be.
I think the huge challenge is, if you get that amount of scrutiny, is you have to make a decision. Do I know who I am, or am I prepared to be the person they think I am? And that may sound ridiculous, but it's absolutely true. So the temptation to morph into the personality be it an online personality or a television personality or a movie personality, is enormous. I had a wonderful thing happen to Patsy and I when we were living in California. We got to know James Stewart and his wife quite well. And what was amazing was James Stewart was exactly the person that he portrayed on the screen. You went to have dinner with him. He had a house with a picket fence. He went and came and opened the door in his carpet slippers, and you went and his wife cooked. And they obviously had some help and everything. But you compare that with the equivalent actors of my own generation and successor generations, it's ridiculous, who have bodyguards and live it. I mean, how can you retain your sense of who you are if in fact what you are is something other people want you to be, not what you are at all? I'm going to bed every night thinking, well, hang on, the person they think I am, I'm not that person. Can you imagine anything making you feel more secure and paranoid?
Yeah, I can't imagine that. And I think sometimes as well, we, the public, we put people on pedestals and we kind of hero worship them and we ascribe all these attributes to them based on, they might have written a really good book or an article, or they're an excellent singer or a musician or artist and stuff like that. And somehow we forget that they're people, like they're just as flawed as we are. And they may not be the nicest person at 9 o'clock in the morning. And, and we get really shocked when they lash out and try and break from the pedestal that we've put them on. So, it's interesting to hear you say this, because this is something that I've kind of just observed myself.
Well, I've known many, many, many extraordinarily successful people, but the amount of them that I could honestly say are happy, very, very few. Some of them quite tortured souls.
Well, it's quite sad, and I'll look at the celebrities that come onto my social media feed in a different light now. So Peter has a question here. How did the Labour Party in Britain get back into government again? Ooh, tricky question.
Well, to be candid, I think that we have a leader who's an honourable, decent man. I don't think he's electable. I really don't. I wish I did. I wish I thought he was. I don't think he's. I think he's a decent guy, and in that sense, he's got a job to do to shape the party and create a party that is electable. That's not going to be easy. We have some talent. I mentioned Darren Jones, who wrote the article in the Times today. There is some real talent there. There's not. I can't say there is an absolutely visible leader. I think Yvette Cooper's got many qualities. She's smart and confident, but it's not insignificant that she's not on the front bench. And maybe she prefers, in a sense, not to be at the moment. I'm horrified says, as I mentioned, David Miliband's a close friend of mine. For me, he's the great lost prime minister, certainly the great lost Labour leader. But there's more talent. I hope this doesn't get quoted back to me. There's probably more talent on the Conservative backbenches among the more liberal Conservatives, the more sensible, traditional Conservatives, than there is on our own backbenches, and that's quite troubling for me.
Yeah, that's a bit of an indictment of the Labour Party. It does feel like, as an outsider looking, if the current Tory government fell, or there was a general election, I really can't believe that Labour would get elected. I think it would be another Tory government, even given the outpouring from Cummings yesterday and the accusations that he has made.
Well, tragically, you're right, and even worse than that, to an extent, is that the conditions under which a Labour government would possibly find themselves in government would be so catastrophic economically and socially that I don't know. I don't even know where a good new Labour government would start. People forget that the very, very successful Labour government of 1945 that had been trained and burnished in the fire. Attlee had been all but running the country while Churchill was running the war. Bevan had been running social services. They were a very, very united and extremely experienced group of people by the time they actually came to power in 1945. And the things like the National Health Service had already been worked through for a couple of years. So, and people tend to forget that that they were not revolutionary, they were evolutionary, and they've been extraordinarily well trained.
Absolutely. I suppose an inexperienced government is always going to have an uphill battle. Absolutely. There's a really interesting question actually from Elizabeth. I'm looking at time now and I realize we've taken a lot of your time. Do you have time for a couple of more questions?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. So there's a question here from Elizabeth. Could you talk about the role of arts in highlighting the fragility of our democracy and how we need to look honestly into the future, given the climate and biodiversity emergencies and the resultant human migration you've referred to?
Well, I think the role of the arts is incredibly significant. And, you know, I teach from here, but I teach filmmakers, and I've got another session, group of sessions coming up in both Belfast and Dublin next month. I mentioned in passing the idea that, you know, if I wanted to write a play about what I see as the future possible scenario for Ireland, the one that alarms me most, it would be a play. So therefore, the people like the very, very fine Irish authors we have, playwrights we have, filmmakers we have, Lenny Abramson's a friend of mine, it's going to be down to them to establish these cautionary tales. I mean, it was very, very nice, Peter, early on saying I was a storyteller. I actually was a movie producer whose job was to get other people's ideas and other people's dreams up on the screen. But those dreams are really important because they're not just dreams, they're also, of course, nightmares. So I think our vision of the future, our vision of what's possible, this is why I'm trying to be positive here, our vision of what's possible will be hugely reliant on the creative world in telling us stories that allow us to say, you know what, that's who we want to be. That's what we want to be like. Those are the things we want to do. And that's what cinema particularly, I think, does brilliantly, allows you to identify with people's problems, with people's opportunities and everything else, to the extent that the audience says, you know what, that could be me. I can see us doing that. But at the same time, I can see us going down that route, and that's not a road we want to go down. So the person most likely to identify this Irish despot that I'm fictionalizing will be the artists. They'll be the first people to spot it. Politicians won't spot it because it'll look like a successful politician, but good artists will spot it.
That's very interesting, very interesting. We must get our artists and writers onto that immediately. Aaron has a question here. Do you have an opinion on Owen Harris being fired by the Sunday Independent for tweeting under a pseudonym?
Yes, and it's a sad thing. I know him very well. He lives nearby, and I like him. I'm very fond of him. He's a controversialist, and he's also a good writer. I think he was bonkers to do it. I think he took leave of his senses because, and I think Fintan O'Toole's takedown of what he did was actually very brilliant, because I don't think it was done with malice. It was done by just, you know, we talked about the honesty of journalists, the way that journalists see themselves and the role that they play. What Owen did, and he knows he did it, he crossed a line. And he crossed the line. He's too good for that. He's a better person than that. And the best thing he could have done is put his hand up, and instead of trying to justify it by saying Edmund Burke did the same thing, he just sort of said, you know what, I'm completely wrong. I should never have done it. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, I agree. He really crossed a line there, and it's a prime example of when somebody should have taken the hit and being honest, and he possibly could come back. You know, he could, but now because he tried to kind of, you know, say, oh, it wasn't that bad, or defend himself, that's what will stick in people's mind, I think, you know.
I can understand. I don't understand why he did it, but knowing him and knowing how much he courts controversy and loves an argument, I can see how he would have been tempted to stir stuff up, as it were, anonymously. But it was a stupid thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. And to be honest, you know, those people who stir things up, you need a few of those in the conversation. You need people to question your views sometimes, but he went about it all wrong. So Peter has a question here. What has been your most challenging film to work on, and what has been the most enjoyable one?
Enjoyable was easy. Local Hero was just a pleasure. It was like going off on holiday with some people and someone bringing a camera. And it was the weather was great. The cast were great. It was just lovely. Script was good. It was affordable. It was the first film I'd done after Chariots where I wasn't worrying every single day about the budget, but we actually had a little bit of flexibility. The most challenging was certainly The Killing Fields, because we were telling a true story. We were telling it in an environment where the people who'd done it and existed were around. We worked right on the borders. We couldn't go to Cambodia, but we were on the borders of Cambodia. By extraordinary irony, the American ambassador to Cambodia was now the ambassador to Thailand. So I was dealing with him and his view of himself, which he changed halfway through the filming. Yeah, and it was what we call in film industry shoot and move. The way that our schedule was set up, it meant we had to move every day to a new location and therefore accept whatever weather we were shooting in. So we just shot whatever God threw at us. And weirdly, it worked because some of the sequences that we shot in sometimes really dreadful weather benefited by it. I mean, it was misery for the crew, misery for everyone making it. But actually what ended up on the screen was possibly better. So the biggest single issue we had, which was shoot, move, ended up giving the film an energy and a reality that it might not have otherwise captured.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a really challenging film to make, just even because you're telling a true story. I mean, that must always be difficult for filmmakers, you know, when they are working on something that's so emotive and so recent, within living memory, to get it accurate and to protect the people that you're telling the story about as well, because it is still their story.
For many people, it was very raw, including the journalists, including the military. It was all very raw. There's a sequence in it, it's a very important sequence, where you see Richard Nixon on television, and our hero, Shambo, sort of anti-hero, is watching him. And that sequence was very important because we allowed us to get Nixon out of his own mouth to lie. So we didn't have to accuse him. Like he was evidentially lying on television to his own people about something we now knew was wrong.
Yeah.
So that took away all the conjecture from it. There was Nixon condemning himself out of his own mouth. Yeah.
Fascinating. James has a question, and this is your last question, and then I'll let you go. How do you feel about social media in the sense of the temptation for all users to present a false sense of truth? I suppose this directly relates to Owen. Showing our best selves, but never our real face, especially for the younger generation growing up with technology. They never asked for. We have made too many mistakes in the world. We are leaving them.
I think it's a very serious question. I mentioned that the big bill coming up for us in the House of the Lords is this called they've changed the name. It was called the Online Harms Bill. They've actually slightly changed the name, but it's a big issue. And I've worked with a number of colleagues in looking to have amendments made to it. Ostensibly, the bill is about harms to children and on online harms to children, both direct online harms and implicit online harms. I think there's a weird thing about kids. Let me digress for a second. One of the most charming things about very young children is the fantasy world they can create for themselves. No one loves more than the idea of a 5-year-old granddaughter or child sitting in a field, creating something or telling a story or talking to her dog as though the dog really exists, or a rabbit. That is a fantastic thing, and it's very, very important to capture that. But when you get to the age of 14, 15, 16, and your make-believe world about yourself starts to be your real world, a couple of very good movies incidentally that touch on this subject, then it's quite dangerous, because at that point, who are you? The whole process of going through your teens is a developmental process of discovering who you are, and pushing away at the potential of what you may have. It isn't about hiding, and it isn't about pretending. And I think that's a kind of very scary line. I think that very good people are beginning to write about this. It tends to be women-led, because the problem is a greater problem for girls and boys. There's no question about that. The online harms stats are far worse for girls than young men. And so it's an issue. It's an issue that all of society's got to confront. It's a parental issue. It's a schools issue. But it also requires a lot more responsibility from the platforms, and they could understand what the enormous psychological damage they could accidentally, and here's the key, they could accidentally be doing vulnerable young people at the most vulnerable moment in their lives, 13, 14, 15. It's really difficult years where kids need every scrap of support. They do not need undermining or questioning their role in the world.
Yeah, it's frightening. You know, as a parent myself, like my kids are quite young, and to be honest, I feel terrified of the idea of them on social media. You know, the the things that get shared, you know, the way that kids talk to each other on social media, the criticisms and the pressures they place on themselves, you know, it was hard enough being a teenager without any of that outside influence, you know, and I think the thing that I find about social media is that it's 24 hours a day. You know, at least if you went to school and you were, you know, maybe getting hassled for somebody at school, you could go home and your home was your haven. You were away from it. They couldn't touch you there. But social media, it's always with you. It's in your pocket, in your phone. It's so pernicious.
What terrifies me is the ability to completely distort men-women relationships through access to pornography is a really disturbing aspect.
Absolutely.
A really disturbing thing. So that's probably another conversation for another day. But that is truly, and that's what this online harms bill is at least attempting to at least address. It's a beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot more work to do there. I'm not going to ask you any more questions, but there's some lovely comments coming in from our audience members. Neve says, I love Local Hero, in my top 5 movies of all time. Eleanor, such a true honor to hear David speak. I could listen all day and agree with every word. Neve says, me too, Eleanor. He has great wisdom and insight and is so interesting to listen to. Thanks so much again to LIR for another excellent talk. Thanks, guys. I love David's energy and passion. I'm hanging on to every word. You have to get him back to talk to us again. Thanks so much, David, and also to the committee. Thank you. Great to have been here for this conversation. Thank you so much. Excellent. So lots of lovely comments coming in. I'm just going to hand over to Peter again. He's just going to close things off. David, it's been fantastic talking to you. I, again, could talk to you all day. There's so much I would like to ask you about. We didn't even get to like all your movies that I want to know more about. You must have so many great stories, but thank you for talking to us today. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful.
It's honestly been a pleasure, and you've made it very comfortable and easy for me. I'm really grateful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Eva, and thanks for your sterling work in answering all those questions. It's been a real mammoth task, I suppose. And I suppose, David, as well, that the idea of your taking a risk today by giving a 20-minute talk and then just focusing mainly on the questions of our attendees, that's been, I suppose, it really worked out well. You know, in that you took a risk, we got out of our comfort zone, and people really enjoyed it. So I feel we've been enthralled by listening to all the topics that you've weaved through throughout the afternoon. And I feel that it's just, I really particularly enjoy, I'm a bit of a film buff, so I really enjoyed the film aspect as well as the politics. And I know I've been answering a lot of questions, but they just came to me as I was sitting listening to you talking away in such an enthralling manner. And I suppose just to thank you again for your time and such an insightful afternoon. And also to mention that next week we have the 6th of our series of talks, which will be Darren Daly. And then following that, the following week, we'll have Thomas Padilla as well.
Okay. Peter, thank you very, very much indeed. Have a great afternoon, guys.
Thank you, David. Thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
So thanks everybody.